Evening, friends. Pull up a chair. Let the day's dust settle. Tonight, we're venturing into a corner of the West where the sun beats down like a blacksmith's hammer and the land itself seems to hold its breath, waiting for a drop of rain that seldom comes. It's a place where hope can wither on the vine faster than any crop, where survival depends not just on grit and determination, but sometimes on a secret whispered by the wind, a hidden spring known only to the oldest eyes. This is a story about a family pushed to the brink by drought and despair, about a powerful man who sees their ruin as his opportunity, and about an old, forgotten soul who holds the key not just to water, but perhaps to a deeper kind of salvation. It's a tale of how life, in the most barren of places, can find a way, often through the most unexpected channels. The dust. That's what Thomas Corbin remembered most about that first year in the New Mexico territory. Dust in his eyes, dust in his throat, dust coating every surface of their small, hastily built adobe cabin. Dust that seemed to mock the parched, cracked earth of the fields he had so painstakingly cleared and planted, fields that now lay barren, the young corn shoots withered and brown under a sky that offered no promise of relief. He stood at the edge of what should have been a thriving cornfield, his shoulders slumped, the familiar weight of despair settling heavy upon him. Beside him, his wife Martha, her face etched with worry, but her eyes still holding a spark of resilience, shaded her own eyes against the relentless glare, looking out at the shimmering heat haze that distorted the distant, sun-baked mesas. Their two children, 8-year-old Emily and 6-year-old Ben, played listlessly near the cabin, their laughter, usually so boisterous, subdued by the oppressive heat and the gnawing uncertainty that had become their constant companion. The Corbins had come west seeking a new life, like so many others. Thomas, a farmer from Ohio whose land had been exhausted by years of single-crop planting, had been lured by pamphlets promising fertile soil, abundant sunshine, and the chance to build a legacy for his children in the land of enchantment. He'd sold everything, packed their meager belongings into a sturdy wagon, and joined a small train of settlers heading towards a valley the pamphlets called Verdant Creek, a name that now felt like a cruel joke. Verdant Creek, when they finally reached it after months of arduous travel, was little more than a shallow, intermittent stream bordered by a narrow strip of marginally fertile land, surrounded by miles of arid plains and rugged, unforgiving desert. Most of the other families on the wagon train had taken one look and pushed on further west, seeking greener pastures. But Thomas, stubborn and perhaps too proud to admit his misjudgment, had decided to stay. He'd seen potential in a particular stretch of land near a bend in the creek, land that seemed to hold moisture longer than the surrounding plains. He'd staked his claim, built their cabin, and poured his heart and soul into tilling the stubborn earth, praying for the rains that the pamphlets had so glibly promised. The first year had been hard, but not impossible. They'd managed a small garden, a meager crop of beans and squash. The creek, though low, had provided enough water for irrigation. They'd built a small community with the few other families who had also chosen to settle in the wider valley: the O'Donnells, the Garcias, the old trapper Jedediah Smith who lived further up the creek. They'd helped each other, shared resources, faced the challenges together. But this year was different. The winter snows in the distant mountains had been pitifully light. The spring rains had failed to materialize. The creek had dwindled to a muddy trickle, then disappeared altogether, leaving behind only cracked earth and withered hopes. Thomas's corn, his cash crop, the one he'd been counting on to see them through the next winter, was dead before it even had a chance to tassel. They were facing ruin. Utter, devastating ruin. Their plight had not gone unnoticed. Riding into their small settlement one sweltering afternoon came a man who represented both the promise and the peril of this harsh land, Marcus Thorne. Yes, friends, that name seems to follow certain kinds of ambition, doesn't it? Though this Thorne is a different shadow cast across a different valley than the one we met with Dr. Miles. This Marcus Thorne was a cattle baron, his vast ranch, the Circle T, sprawling across tens of thousands of acres to the south, his herds numbering in the thousands. He was a man of immense power and influence in the territory, his wealth built on shrewd dealing, relentless expansion, and an unquenchable thirst for more land, more water. He was impeccably dressed, riding a magnificent black stallion, flanked by two hard-eyed, watchful ranch hands. He surveyed the Corbins' withered fields with an expression that mingled feigned sympathy with cold, calculating assessment. "Hard times, Corbin," Thorne said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth, like water over polished stone. "Heard the creek dried up on you. Shame about the corn." He paused, letting his gaze linger on Martha's tired face, on the children's listless forms. "This land, it can be unforgiving. Takes a certain kind of man, a certain kind of operation, to make it pay." Thomas met his gaze steadily, though his heart was heavy. "We'll manage, Mr. Thorne. We're not beaten yet." Thorne smiled, a thin, humorless stretching of his lips. "Admire your grit, Corbin, truly. But grit don't fill bellies when the well runs dry and the crops fail." He leaned forward slightly in his saddle, his voice dropping to a more confidential, almost predatory tone. "Tell you what, I'm expanding my grazing lands, always looking for good parcels, even if they seem temporarily distressed. Your claim here, it adjoins my northern range. Got that spring up in the Box Canyon, I hear. The spring Daniel Hayes's spring from our previous tale? No, let's keep these springs distinct, though the pattern of powerful men coveting them is a familiar one. I'd be willing to take it off your hands. Fair price, considering the circumstances. Enough to see you and your family safely back east, or further west if that's your inclination. Save you a lot of heartache." The offer hung in the air, a poisoned chalice. Fair price? Thomas knew Thorne's reputation. His fair price would be a pittance, barely enough to cover their debts at the distant supply town, let alone finance another move. And the spring, that was the real prize. Their small spring, though diminished by the drought, still trickled, the last reliable water source in this part of the valley. Thorne didn't just want their land, he wanted their water, the lifeblood of the desert. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Thorne," Thomas said, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "But we're not selling. This is our home. We'll see it through." Thorne's smile faded, his eyes hardening. "Suit yourself, Corbin, but don't say I didn't warn you. This land has a way of breaking stubborn men, and when it does, my offer might not be so generous." He wheeled his stallion, his riders falling in behind him, and rode away, leaving behind a cloud of dust and an unspoken threat that settled heavier than the heat itself. The encounter with Thorne cast a deeper pall over the already desperate settlement. The other families, the O'Donnells and the Garcias, faced similar ruin, their own crops withered, their wells drying up. Jedediah Smith, the old trapper who lived a solitary life further up the creek in a rough cabin, seemed to have vanished. His cabin was shuttered, no smoke from his chimney for weeks. They were alone, facing not just the drought, but the predatory ambition of Marcus Thorne. Fear began to gnaw at their resolve. Some talked of abandoning their claims, of accepting Thorne's offer, however meager. What was the point of starving on land that wouldn't yield, especially with Thorne breathing down their necks? Thomas Corbin refused to give up. He was a farmer. The land was in his blood. He couldn't just walk away from the sweat and hope he'd poured into this place. There had to be a way. He started digging their well deeper, a back-breaking, almost hopeless task in the baked earth, finding only damp sand. He ranged further afield, searching for any sign of hidden seeps or springs the drought hadn't yet claimed. He hunted, but the game was scarce, driven away by the lack of water and forage. Martha watched him, her heart aching at his relentless, increasingly desperate efforts, her own hope dwindling with each fruitless day. The children grew thinner, quieter, their youthful energy sapped by hunger and the oppressive atmosphere of fear. Emily, the older one, tried to help her mother, her small face mirroring Martha's worry. Young Ben seemed to retreat into himself, rarely speaking, clutching a small, carved wooden horse Thomas had made for him. It was during one of Thomas's desperate, far-ranging searches for water, high up in the rugged, barren foothills that bordered the desert to the west. A desolate, sun-scorched landscape of cacti, yucca, and crumbling rock formations that most settlers avoided, that he stumbled upon the old man. Or rather, the old man's almost invisible dwelling. Thomas had been following a faint game trail, hoping it might lead to a hidden seep. When he noticed it, a thin, almost transparent plume of smoke rising from behind a jumble of massive, wind-sculpted sandstone boulders. Curious and desperate for any sign of human habitation that wasn't thorns, he approached cautiously. Hidden in a shallow depression behind the boulders, almost invisible until you were right upon it, was a tiny, ancient-looking dwelling, half dugout, half adobe, blending seamlessly with the surrounding rock and sand. A few scraggly, surprisingly green plants grew in carefully tended patches nearby. Chili peppers, beans, a type of hardy squash Thomas didn't recognize. A couple of scrawny goats were tethered in the shade of an overhang. And sitting in the doorway, seemingly as old and weathered as the rocks themselves, was a man. He was small, wizened, his skin the color and texture of dried leather, deeply wrinkled, stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. His hair was long, white, and thin, tied back with a strip of rawhide. His eyes, sunk deep in shadowed sockets, were startlingly bright, sharp, and observant, like those of a desert hawk. He wore simple, patched homespun clothes, and his bare feet were gnarled and calloused. He watched Thomas approach without surprise, without fear, simply observing, as if Thomas were just another dust devil or tumbleweed blowing across his solitary domain. "Agua," Thomas croaked, his throat parched, gesturing towards his empty canteen. "Por favor?" He used the few words of Spanish he knew, assuming the old man might be Mexican or Native American. The old man didn't speak. He simply rose slowly, with a surprising agility for his apparent age, disappeared into the dim interior of his dwelling, and re-emerged with a clay olla filled with cool, clear water. He offered it to Thomas with a silent nod. Thomas drank greedily, the water tasting sweeter, cleaner than any he had tasted in months. He looked around, bewildered. How could there be water here, in this desolate, barren place, when the creek in the valley below was bone dry? How could these plants be green and thriving? "Gracias," Thomas said, handing back the olla. "Muchas gracias. Your water. It is good. From where?" The old man still didn't speak. He merely pointed a gnarled finger towards a narrow, almost invisible fissure in the rock face behind his dwelling. Then he turned and went back to whatever task he had been engaged in before Thomas's arrival, seemingly dismissing him. Thomas hesitated. He was desperate. His family was starving. His neighbors were losing hope. This old man, this hermit living alone in the desert, clearly had a secret source of water, a way to survive, even thrive, in this unforgiving land. Could he share it? Would he? But how to ask? The old man's silence was a formidable barrier. Driven by the image of his children's hungry faces, Thomas persisted. He tried speaking again, in English this time, explaining his plight, the drought, the failing crops, Thorn's threat. The old man listened, or seemed to, his bright eyes never leaving Thomas's face, but he offered no response, no sign of understanding or sympathy. Finally, as the sun began to dip towards the western horizon, Thomas, defeated and disheartened, turned to leave. He had found water for himself for now, but no solution for his family, for his community. As he reached the edge of the clearing, the old man's voice, raspy and low like stones rubbing together, startled him. "Esperar." Wait. Thomas turned back, hope flaring again. The old man was holding out something, a small, crudely woven basket filled with dried beans, a few peppers, and a handful of strange dark seeds. He pressed it into Thomas's hands. Then he pointed again towards the fissure in the rock, then towards the valley where Redemption Creek lay, then made a gesture of digging, of planting. His meaning, though unspoken, was clear. There was water. It could be shared. These seeds, they could grow, even in harsh conditions, if given water. Tears welled in Thomas's eyes. He tried to thank the old man, but words failed him. He clutched the basket, a lifeline, a symbol of hope almost too profound to bear. The old man simply nodded again, then turned and disappeared back into his dwelling, leaving Thomas alone with the setting sun, the basket of seeds, and the astonishing revelation that salvation might lie hidden not in fertile valleys, but in the barren heart of the desert, guarded by a silent, enigmatic hermit. The conflict wasn't just against the drought and thorn anymore. It was now intertwined with the mystery of this old man, his secret water, and the fragile hope he had so unexpectedly offered. Thomas returned to Verdant Creek, for that was still its hopeful, if now ironic name to the settlers, his heart a strange mixture of elation and trepidation. He shared the story of the old man, the hidden water, the basket of seeds, with Martha and the other families. Their reactions were mixed. Martha, seeing the genuine hope in Thomas's eyes and the tangible proof of the beans and peppers, felt a cautious optimism. Young Emily and Ben, tasting the strange, sweet peppers, felt a simple, childlike excitement. But some of the others, particularly James O'Donnell, a pragmatic but increasingly pessimistic Irishman, were skeptical. An old hermit, you say? Living alone in that wasteland? And he just gave you food and seeds and pointed to a crack in a rock? O'Donnell scoffed, his face etched with doubt. Sounds like sunstroke to me, Thomas. Or maybe he's just a crazy old coot, leading you on a wild goose chase. There ain't no water up there. Not enough to save us, anyway. I saw it, James, Thomas insisted. His plants were green. The water was fresh, cool, and these seeds— He held up the small, dark, unfamiliar seeds. He gestured that they would grow here, if we can get the water to them. And how do you propose we do that? O'Donnell challenged. Haul it down in buckets? Even if there is a spring up there, it's miles away, rough country. And Thorne, he ain't gonna like us traipsing around on what he probably considers his land now, looking for phantom wells. The argument highlighted the desperate dilemma. The old man, whom Thomas had learned from a nearly forgotten map, was known only as El Ermitaño, the Hermit, a figure of local legend whispered about by the few remaining Native American and Old Spanish families in the wider territory, had offered a sliver of hope, but accessing it seemed fraught with difficulty and danger. The journey to the hermit's hidden dwelling was arduous, the amount of water they could transport limited. And Marcus Thorne's men were undoubtedly watching the valley, ready to pounce on any sign of renewed activity or hope among the struggling settlers. Thorne wanted them broken, gone. Their survival was a direct challenge to his plans. Despite the skepticism, desperation drove them. With Thomas leading, a small, determined group, including O'Donnell, who came along more out of a grim curiosity than belief, and young Miguel Garcia, whose family was perhaps hardest hit by the drought, set out the next morning, carrying empty barrels and canteens, heading towards the barren foothills where the hermit lived. Martha stayed behind with the children and the other women, praying for their success, her heart heavy with a mixture of hope and fear. The journey was as difficult as Thomas remembered. The sun beat down mercilessly, the terrain was brutal, but the thought of the cool, clear water, the image of the hermit's inexplicably green patches, drove them onward. When they finally reached the hidden dwelling, the hermit was there, sitting in his doorway, watching them approach as if he had been expecting them. He offered no greeting, no surprise, just that same silent, watchful gaze. Thomas, through gestures and a mixture of broken Spanish and English, tried to explain their need, their desperation. He pointed to the empty barrels, to the parched valley below. The hermit listened, his ancient eyes seeming to understand more than words could convey. Then he rose slowly and led them, not just to the fissure in the rock, but through it. The fissure opened into a narrow, hidden canyon, a secret green oasis in the heart of the desolate landscape. A small, clear stream trickled down from a series of seeps high up on the canyon wall, pooling into a deep, rock-lined basin, the hermit's secret well, his life source. Lush vegetation grew along the stream banks, not just the hardy desert plants, but ferns, willows, even a few gnarled fruit trees Thomas didn't recognize. It was a miracle of nature, a hidden Eden protected by the harshness of the surrounding desert. The men stared, speechless. O'Donnell's skepticism vanished, replaced by stunned disbelief, then dawning awe. They filled their barrels and canteens, the cool water a balm to their parched throats and weary spirits. The hermit watched them, his expression still unreadable, but perhaps with a flicker of something else in his ancient eyes. Satisfaction. or just the quiet patience of the desert itself. As they prepared to leave, laden with precious water, the hermit stopped Thomas. He pressed a small, dried gourd into Thomas's hand. Inside were more of the dark seeds and a few carefully preserved cuttings from the strange fruit trees. He then made a series of gestures, pointing to the seeds, then to their valley, then miming the act of digging channels, of diverting water, of planting and tending. His message was clear. This water, these plants, they could bring life back to Verdant Creek if the settlers were willing to work, to learn, to adapt, to respect the harsh lessons of the desert. He was offering them not just a temporary reprieve, but a sustainable solution, a different way of farming, a different way of living in harmony with this unforgiving land. The journey back was filled with a new, almost exultant energy, despite the heavy water barrels. They had found water. They had found hope. But their elation was short-lived. As they neared Verdant Creek, moving cautiously under the cover of dusk, they saw them. Two of Marcus Thorne's riders, patrolling the edge of the valley, their rifles glinting in the fading light. Thorne was tightening his grip, watching their every move. Transporting enough water from the hermit's hidden well to irrigate their fields, to save their community, would be a monumental task, made infinitely more dangerous by Thorne's constant surveillance. The hermit had given them a key, but the lock was still guarded by a powerful, ruthless enemy. The struggle for Verdant Creek was far from over. It had merely entered a new, more perilous phase, a desperate race against time, drought, and the insatiable greed of Marcus Thorne. The discovery of the hermit's secret well, El Pozo Escondido, as the settlers began to call it, transformed the mood in Verdant Creek, but it also intensified their predicament. Hope, now tangible in the form of cool, clear water, warred with the ever-present fear of Marcus Thorne. They began the arduous task of hauling water, initially in secret, under the cover of darkness, using the few sturdy barrels they possessed. Thomas O'Donnell, now a reluctant convert, and Miguel Garcia made repeated exhausting trips to the hidden canyon, their bodies aching, their nerves frayed by the constant threat of discovery by Thorne's patrols. The amount of water they could transport was pitifully small compared to the needs of their dying fields and thirsty families. But it was enough to keep their essential garden patches alive, to provide drinking water, to sustain a fragile flicker of resistance. Martha Corbin, along with Maria Garcia and Bridget O'Donnell, took charge of rationing the precious water, ensuring every drop was used wisely. They carefully nurtured the strange seeds and cuttings the hermit had provided, planting them in small, protected plots near their cabins, tending them with a desperate hope. These were not the familiar corn and beans of their Ohio past. These were hardy desert plants, adapted to scarcity, promising a different kind of sustenance if they could be coaxed to grow. The hermit himself remained an enigma. He never visited Verdant Creek, never sought thanks or reward. But occasionally, when Thomas or Miguel made the trek to El Pozo Escondido, they would find him there, a silent, watchful presence. He would offer them cool water from the spring, sometimes a handful of dried fruit or roasted nuts. He observed their efforts, occasionally offering a cryptic gesture or a single, guttural word in a language they didn't understand but somehow conveyed meaning. A warning about a loose rock on the trail, an indication of where to find certain edible roots, a disapproval of their wasteful haste. He was teaching them, in his own silent way, the rhythms of the desert, the discipline of survival in an arid land. Thomas began to understand that the hermit wasn't just guarding a secret well. He was a guardian of ancient knowledge, a living testament to a way of life long forgotten by men who sought to conquer the land rather than coexist with it. Marcus Thorne, meanwhile, was not idle. He knew the settlers were getting water from somewhere. His patrols reported faint tracks leading towards the barren western foothills, but they couldn't pinpoint the source. Thorne, frustrated by their continued resistance, his plans for easy acquisition of the valley thwarted, escalated his campaign of intimidation. His riders became more brazen, running off the settlers' few remaining chickens, deliberately fouling the last muddy puddles in the dry creek bed near the settlement, firing shots over the cabins at night to terrorize the women and children. He wanted to break their spirit, force them to abandon their claims before the distant, slow-moving machinery of territorial law could intervene on their behalf, if it ever would. The settlers, though terrified, refused to break. Their shared struggle, their reliance on each other, and the mysterious hope offered by El Pozo Escondido had forged a new, steely resilience. They organized watches, armed themselves as best they could with old hunting rifles and shotguns, and presented a united, if desperate, front. Thomas Corbin, by default, became their reluctant leader, his quiet determination inspiring others, though the weight of responsibility pressed heavily upon him. He knew they were outgunned, outnumbered. A direct confrontation with Thorne's men would be disastrous. Their only hope lay in endurance, in the hermit's secret water, and perhaps in some unforeseen intervention. The tension reached a breaking point one sweltering afternoon. Thorne, impatient and arrogant, rode into Verdant Creek himself, flanked by a dozen of his toughest riders, including his brutal foreman, a man named Rollins known for his quick temper and quicker gun. Thorne reined in before the assembled settlers, who stood silently, defiantly, in front of Thomas Corbin's cabin, their faces grim, their hands clutching whatever meager weapons they possessed. "This farce has gone on long enough, Corbin," Thorne sneered, his eyes sweeping over their ragged forms with contempt. "I know you're getting water from somewhere up in those hills. My water likely from springs on Circle T land you're trespassing on." A blatant lie, as El Pozo Escondido was deep in unclaimed territorial land, but Thorne cared little for such distinctions. "I'm giving you one last chance. Abandon these claims by sunrise tomorrow. Take what you can carry, or my men and I will burn you out. And this time," his gaze hardened, "there will be no accidents. It will be deliberate and thorough." The threat hung in the hot, still air, heavy and suffocating. Thomas looked at his wife, at his children huddled behind her, at the fearful but resolute faces of his neighbors. He knew they couldn't win a direct fight, but surrender meant losing everything, betraying the hope the hermit had offered. "This is our land, Thorne," Thomas said, his voice hoarse but steady. "We have deeds. We won't be driven off by threats." Thorne laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Deeds? In this territory, Corbin, possession is 9/10 of the law, and I intend to possess this valley." He turned to Rollins. "See that they understand the terms, Foreman. No misunderstandings." He wheeled his horse and rode back towards his camp, leaving Rollins and his men to enforce his ultimatum. Rollins, a cruel grin splitting his face, dismounted, his men spreading out, their guns held ready. "You heard the boss," Rollins growled, swaggering towards Thomas. "Sunrise, or fire, your choice, sodbuster." He spat contemptuously at Thomas's feet. Just as Rollins reached for Thomas, perhaps intending to provoke a fight that would give him an excuse to start the violence early, a movement from the direction of the western foothills caught everyone's attention. A lone figure, moving with surprising speed and silence, was approaching the settlement. It was the hermit. He carried no visible weapon, only his gnarled walking staff. He walked directly towards Rollins and his men, his ancient eyes, bright and fierce, fixed on the foreman. Rollins, momentarily surprised by the sudden appearance of this strange, silent old man, hesitated. His men looked uncertain. The hermit stopped a few feet from Rollins. He didn't speak. He simply raised his staff and pointed it, not at Rollins, but towards the distant, shimmering peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, barely visible on the eastern horizon. Then he lowered the staff and drew a line in the dust with its tip, directly between Rollins and the settlers. He tapped the line once, then turned his back on Rollins and walked slowly, deliberately towards Thomas Corbin's cabin, ignoring the stunned silence, the bristling guns of Thorne's men. He sat down on the rough porch step facing the settlers, his back to Rollins, a silent, immovable presence. His action, so unexpected, so fearless, so utterly inexplicable to Rollins and his men, momentarily broke the foreman's aggressive momentum. What did it mean? The pointing staff? The line in the dust? Rollins looked confused, then angry. "What in the hell?" he began, taking a step towards the old man. "Leave him be," Thomas Corbin said, stepping forward, positioning himself between Rollins and the hermit. He didn't understand the old man's gesture either, but he felt a surge of protective courage. He's harmed no one. He's under our protection. Rollins stared from Thomas to the silent old man, then at the other settlers who had instinctively moved to stand with Thomas, their expressions hardening. He was outnumbered, not in guns perhaps, but in something else. A sudden, inexplicable shift in the atmosphere, a sense of ancient power, of boundaries drawn that he didn't understand but felt reluctant to cross. He hesitated, then swore under his breath. "Sunrise, Corbin," Rollins snarled, backing down for the moment, his bravado dented. "Don't forget." He motioned to his men, and they remounted, riding back towards Thorne's camp, leaving behind a tense, bewildered, but strangely emboldened group of settlers, and a silent old man sitting calmly on a porch step, his back to the departing threat. The hermit, by his simple, cryptic act of defiance, had bought them a little more time, and perhaps sown the first seeds of a different kind of resistance. The emotional twist wasn't a betrayal, but an act of inexplicable, silent courage from the most unlikely source, shifting the dynamics of the confrontation in a way no one could have predicted. The hermit's unexpected intervention left Verdant Creek in a state of bewildered hope and heightened tension. His silent defiance of Rollins had been astonishing, but what did it mean? The line in the dust? The pointing staff? The settlers gathered around Thomas Corbin's cabin, looking towards the old man who still sat impassively on the porch, his gaze fixed on some distant point only he could see. "What do you reckon he meant, Thomas?" James O'Donnell asked, his voice hushed with awe and confusion. "That pointin', was it a sign? A warnin'?" Thomas shook his head, equally mystified. "I don't know, James, but he bought us time, and he showed no fear. Maybe he knows something we don't." Martha Corbin, her practical nature reasserting itself, approached the hermit hesitantly, offering him a dipper of precious water from their dwindling supply. He accepted it with a slight inclination of his head, drinking slowly, his ancient eyes meeting hers for a moment, holding a depth of understanding that transcended language. He then gestured again towards the eastern mountains, then towards the parched fields, then made a sweeping motion with his hand as if encompassing the entire valley, finally tapping his chest lightly. He seemed to be trying to convey a connection, a forgotten history, a deeper claim to this land than Thorne's paper titles. As night fell, a council of war, or perhaps desperation, was held in the Corbin cabin. They had until sunrise. Rollins and Thorne's men would return, and this time they would likely show no restraint. Surrender seemed inevitable, yet the hermit's strange courage had ignited a spark of defiance. Could they fight? They were outnumbered, outgunned. Their only advantage was their knowledge of the immediate terrain, their desperate courage, and now this enigmatic old man who seemed to possess some unknown power or secret. It was young Miguel Garcia who voiced a desperate idea. "El Ermitaño. He knows these hills better than anyone. He knows secret paths, hiding places. Maybe he can lead us out, away from Thorne to another valley, another chance." "Run again?" O'Donnell scoffed, though his earlier pessimism was tempered by a grudging respect for the hermit. "Where would we go? We have women, children. Thorne would hunt us down." "Not if we don't run west," Thomas mused, looking towards the distant Sangre de Cristos the hermit had indicated. "If we go east, over the mountains, it's rough country, hardly traveled. Thorne wouldn't expect it. He thinks we're trapped here in the valley." He looked at the hermit, who had silently entered the cabin and was listening intently. "Can it be done, old man? Is there a way over those mountains?" The hermit met Thomas's gaze. He nodded slowly, then pointed towards himself, then towards the eastern peaks, then made a gesture of walking, of leading. Yes, he knew a way, a secret way. The decision was made, born of desperation and a fragile trust in the silent old man. They would not wait for Thorne's sunrise ultimatum. They would leave Verdant Creek tonight, under the cover of darkness, abandoning their homes, their fields, everything they had built, and follow the hermit on a perilous journey eastward, over the mountains, towards an unknown future. It was a desperate gamble, perhaps their last. Their meager belongings were quickly bundled, food and water were carefully rationed, Weapons were checked and loaded. Fear mingled with a grim resolve. As the last sliver of moon dipped below the horizon, casting the valley into profound darkness, the small band of settlers, led by the silent hermit and Thomas Corbin, slipped out of Verdant Creek. They moved like ghosts, the children carried or walking hand in hand with their parents, their footsteps muffled by the soft dust. Shadow, the dog from a previous tale who seems to have wandered into this one as well, or perhaps a different loyal canine companion, scouted ahead with the hermit, his senses alert for any sign of Thorn's patrols. They left behind their empty cabins, their withered fields, the bitter taste of broken promises, carrying with them only what was essential for survival, and a desperate flickering flame of hope, kindled by an old man who spoke more with his eyes and his staff than with words. The journey over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains was an ordeal that tested them to the very limits of human endurance. The hermit led them on paths that seemed impossible, narrow goat trails clinging to sheer cliff faces, treacherous scree slopes, dense, tangled forests where the sun barely penetrated. He moved with an uncanny knowledge of the terrain, seeming to sense the safest routes, the hidden springs, the sheltered places to rest. He taught them how to find edible roots and berries, how to read the signs of weather, how to move silently, conserving their strength. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a constant reassurance, his resilience an inspiration. Days blurred into a relentless cycle of climbing, walking, enduring. They faced blizzards at high altitude, forded icy rivers, struggled through deep snowdrifts even as spring approached in the lower valleys. Food ran out. Hunger became a constant companion. Weakness gnawed at them, but they pressed on, driven by the hermit's unwavering example and the desperate hope of finding sanctuary on the other side. Young Ben Corbin, weakened by privation, fell ill, his small body racked by fever. Martha and Thomas feared they would lose him, but the hermit found strange, potent herbs high on a windswept ridge, brewing a bitter tea that slowly, miraculously, brought the fever down. He seemed to possess a deep, almost magical connection to the mountains, drawing strength and healing from the very wilderness that threatened to consume them. During this brutal trek, the settlers learned more about the hermit, not through words, but through his actions, his knowledge, the ancient sorrow in his eyes. They began to understand that he was not just a solitary old man, but perhaps the last survivor of a people who had inhabited these mountains for generations, people who understood the delicate balance of nature, who had lived in harmony with the land until they were driven out, their ways forgotten, their sacred places desecrated by men like Thorn. His pointing staff, they realized, wasn't just a walking stick. It was a symbol of his connection to this land, his stewardship. The line he had drawn in the dust before Rawlins, it had been a declaration, a reclaiming of ancient boundaries. His leading them eastward wasn't just an escape, it was a pilgrimage, a return to ancestral lands, perhaps. They also learned about Marcus Thorn's deeper connection to this region. The hermit, through gestures and a few halting Spanish words to Miguel Garcia who could translate, revealed that Thorn's Circle T Ranch wasn't just built on shrewd land acquisition. It was built on stolen water, on diverted streams that had once fed fertile hidden valleys high in the mountains, valleys known only to the hermit's people. Thorn's insatiable greed hadn't just destroyed the settlers' hopes in Verdant Creek. It was slowly killing the entire ecosystem, starving the land, driving away the game, poisoning the ancient balance. El Pozo Escondido, the hermit's secret well, was perhaps one of the last untouched sources, a sacred place he had shared with them out of desperation, or perhaps out of a deeper purpose. This revelation cast Thorn's actions in a new, even more sinister light. He wasn't just a greedy cattle baron, he was a destroyer, a man whose ambition was a blight on the land itself. The settlers' struggle for survival became intertwined with a larger, older conflict, a fight to protect not just their own small claims, but the very soul of the mountains. Finally, after weeks of unimaginable hardship, they descended from the high peaks into a hidden valley on the eastern slope of the Sangre de Cristos. It was a place of breathtaking beauty, untouched by the drought that plagued the western plains. A clear, vibrant river flowed through lush meadows. Tall pines and aspens clothed the surrounding slopes. Game was plentiful, It was a sanctuary, a true verdant creek, a place where they could not only survive, but thrive. The hermit had led them to his people's ancestral home, a place Thorn hadn't yet found, hadn't yet despoiled, but their arrival did not go unnoticed. As they made camp near the river, weary but filled with a renewed sense of hope, a group of riders appeared, emerging silently from the trees. They were not Thorn's men. They were Ute warriors, their faces stern, their weapons ready. They had clearly been watching the settlers' descent. The hermit stepped forward, raising his staff, speaking to them in a language the settlers didn't understand, his voice no longer raspy, but carrying a strange, resonant authority. The UTEs listened, their expressions slowly softening from suspicion to something else: respect, recognition. After a long exchange, the lead warrior dismounted, approached the hermit, and clasped his arm in a gesture of profound acknowledgement. The hermit, it turned out, was not just a solitary survivor. He who remembers the paths, a revered elder, a keeper of lore for several scattered bands of Ute and other displaced native peoples who still clung to their traditional ways in the hidden corners of the mountains. His pointing staff was a symbol of his lineage, his knowledge. The line in the dust had been a warning to Thorn that he was trespassing on sacred, protected ground. His leading the settlers here was not just an act of compassion, but a strategic move, bringing potential allies into a hidden stronghold against a common enemy, Marcus Thorn, whose expanding empire threatened them all. The emotional twist was profound. The settlers hadn't just been saved by a kind old man, they had been guided by a leader, a spiritual guardian, into an alliance they never could have imagined. Their struggle for a small patch of farmland had become part of a much larger, older fight for the preservation of a way of life, for the sanctity of the land itself. The old man with the secret desert well was far more than he appeared. He was a bridge between worlds, a catalyst for an unlikely union against a shared, powerful foe. Their survival now depended not just on their own resilience, but on their willingness to trust, to learn from, and to fight alongside these new, unexpected allies. The fate of Verdant Creek, and perhaps the future of the entire region, now rested on this fragile, unprecedented alliance, forged in shared hardship and a common desire to see justice done and the land healed. The Ute warriors, led by their stoic chief Black Hawk, treated the settlers not as intruders, but with a cautious, reserved respect, recognizing them as allies brought by He who remembers the paths. For that was how they referred to the hermit, whose given name remained a mystery, perhaps deliberately. They shared food, fresh venison, dried berries, strange but nourishing roots. They offered shelter in their own well-hidden winter camp, a collection of sturdy lodges nestled in a sheltered cove further up the valley. The settlers, exhausted and overwhelmed, accepted gratefully their initial fear of the wild Indians, slowly giving way to a bewildered appreciation for their unexpected hospitality and the hermit's profound influence. A council was held. Black Hawk, the hermit, Thomas Corbin, James O'Donnell, and Miguel Garcia sat around a fire. The pipe of peace passed between them. Through the hermit's often cryptic but surprisingly effective translation, he seemed to understand more English than he let on, and Black Hawk knew some Spanish from past trading. A plan began to form. Marcus Thorn could not be allowed to continue his destructive expansion. His illegal diversions of water upstream were not only starving Verdant Creek, but also impacting the hunting grounds and sacred sites of the Ute and other bands. His arrogance, his belief that he could take whatever he wanted with impunity, had to be challenged, not just for the sake of the settlers, but for the future of the mountains themselves. The plan was audacious, relying on a combination of the settlers' knowledge of Thorn's immediate operations and the UTE's intimate familiarity with the vast, rugged wilderness, their skills in tracking, stealth, and unconventional warfare. They would not try to reclaim Verdant Creek directly, not yet. Thorn's forces there were too entrenched. Instead, they would strike at the sources of Thorn's power, his vulnerable supply lines from the distant railhead town, his outlying cattle camps, and most importantly, the series of illegal dams and diversion channels he had constructed high in the mountains to steal water from the main rivers that fed the entire region. Disrupting these would not only weaken Thorn economically, but also, hopefully, draw the attention of territorial authorities who might have previously ignored the settlers' plight, but couldn't ignore a major disruption to regional water supplies or widespread unrest involving native tribes. It was a dangerous strategy, fraught with risk. Retaliation from Thorn would be swift and brutal if they were caught. And success depended on an unprecedented level of trust and cooperation between two vastly different cultures that had often viewed each other with suspicion and hostility. But desperation and the quiet, unifying presence of the hermit forged a powerful bond. Over the next few weeks, small, coordinated raiding parties, consisting of Ute warriors and a few of the more able-bodied settlers like Thomas and Miguel, began to strike. They moved like ghosts, guided by Little Hawk, the same young Ute scout who had aided Lydia Carter in another valley. Another struggle, for heroism and courage often echo across these tales, and other skilled trackers. They ambushed Thorn's supply wagons on remote mountain trails, taking what they needed: food, ammunition, tools, and scattering or burning the rest. They raided his outlying cattle camps, driving off small herds of cattle, creating confusion and fear among his ranch hands. They systematically began to dismantle his illegal dams, using tools borrowed from his own wagons, restoring the natural flow of water to streams that had been dry for years. These actions, small in scale but widespread and persistent, began to have an effect. Thorn's operations were disrupted. His costs mounted. His men grew increasingly jumpy, demoralized by fighting an enemy they rarely saw, an enemy who seemed to know their every move. Thorn himself, back at his main ranch headquarters, grew furious, demanding his foreman, Rollins, who had apparently recovered from his earlier encounter with the hermit and the settlers, to hunt down and destroy these savages and their white sympathizers. Rollins, however, found himself outmaneuvered at every turn. The UTEs, guided by the hermit's strategic wisdom, knew the mountains too well. They set traps, created diversions, led Rollins's posses on fruitless chases through treacherous terrain, always fading away before a direct confrontation could occur. The settlers, though not directly involved in most of the raids, played a crucial supporting role, providing shelter and supplies to the raiding parties, gathering intelligence from travelers, their small, hidden valley becoming a vital sanctuary and base of operations for the growing resistance. Martha Corbin, Maria Garcia, and Bridget O'Donnell, along with the Ute women, worked tirelessly, tending to the wounded, for there were casualties on both sides, though few and far between for the raiders, preparing food, maintaining the fragile community's morale. Young Emily and Ben Corbin, along with the Ute children, forgot their earlier fears, their shared games and laughter echoing through the hidden valley, a poignant symbol of the unlikely alliance. The hermit remained the spiritual and strategic center of this resistance. He rarely participated directly in the raids, his age, and perhaps his own past experiences making him reluctant to engage in direct violence. But his knowledge of Thorn's weaknesses, his understanding of the land, his ability to inspire and unite disparate groups were invaluable. He taught the settlers and the UTEs alike about sustainability, about taking only what was needed, about respecting the balance of nature even in warfare. He was not just fighting Thorn, he was teaching a different way of living, a different way of seeing the world. The conflict escalated. Thorn, enraged by his losses and the territorial authorities' slow response to his demands for military intervention, they were wary of being drawn into a wider Indian war, especially with the legality of Thorn's claims now under question thanks to rumors perhaps started by Lydia Carter and Colonel Standish in another parallel struggle against a different Thorn, grew more desperate, more ruthless. He offered huge bounties for the capture of any Ute or settler involved in the raids, dead or alive. He sent out heavily armed patrols with orders to shoot on sight. The mountains became a dangerous chessboard, with small bands of raiders and larger posses maneuvering for advantage, the stakes rising with each passing day. During one particularly daring raid to destroy a key dam high in the mountains, Thomas Corbin and Little Hawk found themselves cut off, surrounded by a large force led by Rollins himself. A fierce firefight ensued. Little Hawk was wounded, shot in the leg. Thomas, fighting desperately to protect his friend, managed to hold off Rollins's men long enough for other Ute warriors, alerted by the sounds of battle, to create a diversion, allowing Thomas to drag the wounded Little Hawk to safety, deeper into a network of hidden caves known only to the UTEs and the Hermit. They were trapped, Little Hawk losing blood, Rawlins's men searching the caves relentlessly. Just as despair began to set in, the Hermit appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, moving silently through the darkened passages. He carried not a weapon, but his familiar pouch of herbs and a small, glowing ember. He tended to Little Hawk's wound with practiced skill, his touch surprisingly gentle, his presence radiating an aura of calm that steadied Thomas's frayed nerves. Then, he led them through a series of almost invisible crawl spaces and hidden tunnels, emerging miles away, high on a different ridge, leaving Rawlins's men to search fruitlessly in the empty caves. How he knew they were there, how he found them, how he knew these secret passages. It was another mystery, another testament to his profound connection to these mountains. This incident, Little Hawk's injury and their narrow escape, sobered the raiders. They realized Thorn and Rawlins were growing more desperate, more dangerous. The risks were increasing. They needed a decisive blow, something that would not just hurt Thorn, but break his power, expose his crimes to a wider world, force the territorial authorities to act definitively. It was the Hermit who conceived the final, audacious plan. He knew of Thorn's greatest vulnerability, not his cattle or his land, but his carefully constructed image of respectability, his political connections back east, the sources of his capital. Thorn maintained a secret ledger, the Hermit explained, detailing his illegal land grabs, his bribery of officials, his true profits from stolen water and resources, a ledger even more damning than the one Dr. Jedediah Miles had sought in another time, another place. This ledger, if it could be found and delivered to the right hands, would destroy Thorn utterly. The Hermit believed Thorn kept it hidden not at his main ranch, which was too exposed, but in a fortified private study at a remote line cabin he used for discreet meetings, a place few knew existed, nestled deep in a canyon supposedly on undisputed Circle T land. The Hermit, from his years of solitary wandering, knew its exact location. The plan was to raid the line cabin, secure the ledger, and then, using the UTE's knowledge of hidden trails, get it to a trusted contact the Hermit knew in Santa Fe, an honest journalist, or perhaps a crusading lawyer, someone who could ensure its contents reached the highest levels of territorial and federal government, bypassing Thorn's corrupted local network. It was incredibly risky. The line cabin would be guarded. Thorn himself might even be there. But it was their best, perhaps their only chance to end Thorn's reign of terror for good. Thomas Corbin, Miguel Garcia, and a small elite group of Ute warriors, including a now-recovered Little Hawk, volunteered for the mission. The Hermit, despite his age, insisted on guiding them. This was personal. This was the culmination of a lifetime of injustice. The climax of their struggle would not be a battle for land or water in Verdant Creek, but a desperate infiltration, a high-stakes gamble deep in the heart of enemy territory, to seize the one weapon Thorn feared most, the truth. Their alliance, born of shared desperation, now faced its ultimate test, with the fate of countless lives and the future of the entire region hanging in the balance, dependent on the courage of a few good men and the ancient wisdom of an old man who remembered the paths. The raid on Thorn's remote line cabin was planned with meticulous care, every detail overseen by the Hermit. He knew the terrain around the cabin intimately, the approaches, the blind spots, the patterns of the guards Thorn usually kept there. They would move under the cover of a moonless night, a small, silent force. Thomas, Miguel, Little Hawk, and 3 other skilled Ute warriors, with the Hermit as their guide and strategic mind. Their objective was not to engage in a prolonged firefight, but to get in, secure the ledger, and get out, quickly and quietly. The journey to the cabin was tense, each man acutely aware of the stakes. They moved like shadows through the rugged canyons, avoiding Thorn's patrols, their senses heightened, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, a potential alarm. The Hermit led them with unerring accuracy, his ancient eyes seeming to pierce the darkness. As they neared the cabin, nestled in a narrow, defensible canyon, they could see the faint glow of lamplight from its windows. 2 guards were visible, patrolling lazily near the porch. Others, the hermit suspected, would be inside, or perhaps in the small bunkhouse nearby. The hermit outlined the final plan in hushed whispers. Little Hawk and another Ute warrior, masters of stealth, would neutralize the outside sentries silently. Thomas and Miguel, providing covering fire if necessary, would then create a small diversion at the front of the cabin, perhaps a sudden noise, a thrown rock to draw attention. While the remaining guards were distracted, the hermit, with one other Ute, would attempt to slip in through a back window or door, locations the hermit seemed to recall from some distant, unstated past knowledge of the cabin's construction. Their target, Thorne's private study, where the ledger was believed to be hidden. The execution began flawlessly. Little Hawk and his companion moved like phantoms, dispatching the two outside sentries with silent, deadly efficiency, using only knives and garrots. No alarm was raised. Thomas, his heart pounding, took a deep breath and hurled a fist-sized rock against the heavy front door of the cabin. The sound echoed sharply in the stillness. Inside, they heard a surprised shout, the scrape of chairs, then heavy footsteps approaching the door. As the front door creaked open and a rough-looking guard peered out suspiciously, the hermit and his Ute companion, having already pried open a shuttered-back window, slipped silently into the darkened interior of the cabin. The diversion had worked. Thomas and Miguel remained hidden, guns ready, watching the front, listening intently. Inside, the hermit moved with an uncanny familiarity, navigating the dark rooms as if he had been there before. He led his companion directly to a small, locked door at the end of a short hallway, Thorne's study. The Ute warrior, skilled with locks, quickly and silently picked the simple mechanism. They slipped inside. The study was small, opulent for a line cabin, dominated by a large oak desk. A single lamp burned low on the desk, casting flickering shadows. And sitting at the desk, not a guard, but Marcus Thorne himself, looking up in startled surprise as the two figures materialized from the darkness. He hadn't expected an attack here, in his private sanctuary. His hand instinctively went to the drawer where he kept a pistol. The hermit was faster. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply raised his staff, pointed it directly at Thorne's heart, and spoke, his voice no longer raspy or hesitant, but filled with a cold, ancient authority, in a language Thorne clearly understood, perhaps Spanish, perhaps something older. El tiempo de pagar ha llegado, Marcus Thorne. The time to pay has come. Thorne froze, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief, dawning recognition, and superstitious fear. He seemed to see not just an old man, but a ghost from his past, an accuser, a judge. The hermit's Ute companion moved swiftly, disarming Thorne before he could recover, binding his hands securely. Then, the search for the ledger began. The hermit seemed to know exactly where to look. He ignored the obvious desk drawers, the small wall safe. Instead, he went to a section of the wall paneled with dark, heavy wood, tapped it in a specific sequence, and a hidden compartment sprang open. Inside lay a single, thick, leather-bound ledger. The hermit took it, his eyes burning with a grim, triumphant light. He had it. The truth. The weapon that would finally bring Marcus Thorne down. But just as they were about to signal Thomas and Miguel that the objective was secured, disaster struck. One of Thorne's guards, perhaps alerted by some sixth sense or the unnatural silence from the study, had circled around to the back of the cabin. He saw the open window, heard faint movements inside. He raised the alarm, firing his rifle into the air. Outside, all hell broke loose. Thomas and Miguel found themselves under heavy fire from the bunkhouse as the alerted guards poured out, guns blazing. Little Hawk and the other Ute, their mission to maintain silence now irrelevant, engaged the guards in a fierce firefight from their positions near the front of the cabin, trying to buy time for the hermit to escape with the ledger. Inside the study, Thorne, seeing a chance, lunged wildly at the hermit, despite his bound hands, trying to knock the ledger from his grasp. The hermit, though old, was surprisingly strong and agile. He sidestepped Thorne's clumsy attack, but the Ute warrior with him was forced to subdue Thorne more forcefully, knocking him unconscious with a blow to the head. "We must go," the Ute urged, grabbing the ledger as the hermit seemed to sway, perhaps from exertion or the sudden violence. "Through the front, now!" They burst out of the study into the main room of the cabin, just as Thorne's guards, having driven Thomas and Miguel back temporarily, were attempting to storm the front door. The hermit, seeing the Ute warrior about to charge into overwhelming odds, did something unexpected. He pushed the warrior and the precious ledger towards a heavy oak table. Then, with a strength no one would have believed he possessed, he overturned the table, creating a makeshift barricade. "Go!" he commanded the Ute, pointing towards the back window they had entered. "Take the book. Get it to Black Hawk. Tell him the paths are clear now." The Ute hesitated, unwilling to leave the old man, but the hermit's eyes blazed with an undeniable authority. "Go. It is my time to draw the line, for the last time." Reluctantly, the Ute warrior, clutching the ledger, scrambled out the back window and disappeared into the darkness, just as Thorne's guards finally broke through the front door. The hermit stood alone in the center of the room, his staff held before him like a sacred weapon, facing the enraged guards. He didn't try to fight. He simply stood there, a figure of immense, ancient dignity, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the chaos, a faint, serene smile on his lips. Thomas, Miguel, and Little Hawk, seeing the cabin overrun, knowing the hermit was trapped, fought with renewed fury from outside, trying to draw the guards' fire, trying to create an opening. But it was too late. They heard a volley of shots from inside the cabin, then a profound, terrible silence. When they finally managed to fight their way into the cabin moments later, driving the remaining, now leaderless and demoralized guards back, they found him. The hermit lay crumpled on the floor near the overturned table, his staff still clutched in his hand, his lifeblood staining the rough wooden planks. He had drawn his last line. He had protected the truth, ensured its escape, at the cost of his own life. But his faint smile remained, a look of peace, of purpose fulfilled. He who remembers the paths had finally found his rest, his sacrifice paving the way for justice to finally dawn on the lands he had loved and protected for so long. The climax was not just the seizure of the ledger, but the old man's ultimate selfless act of courage, ensuring the truth would survive even if he did not. The death of the hermit, he who remembers the paths, cast a profound, sorrowful pall over the victory. Thomas, Miguel, Little Hawk, and the Ute warrior who had escaped with the ledger mourned him deeply, their grief raw and personal. He had been more than just a guide, more than just an ally. He had been their spiritual anchor, their connection to a wisdom and a resilience they were only beginning to understand. But his sacrifice had not been in vain. The ledger, the damning record of Marcus Thorne's years of corruption, greed, and violence, was safe. They retreated from Thorne's line cabin, carrying the body of the hermit with solemn dignity, leaving behind the unconscious Thorne and his defeated, scattered guards. They knew Rollins would soon arrive with reinforcements, but it no longer mattered. The key to Thorne's destruction was now in their hands. The Ute warrior, true to the hermit's last command, carried the ledger swiftly and secretly through the mountains to Chief Black Hawk. Black Hawk, upon learning of the hermit's death and seeing the contents of the ledger, acted decisively. He sent riders not just to the distant journalist in Santa Fe the hermit had spoken of, but also directly to the territorial governor and to Colonel Miles Standish at Fort Laramie, the same officer who had played a role in the Redemption Creek affair, for the tendrils of these stories often intertwine, along with trusted emissaries carrying copies of the most incriminating pages and a formal petition demanding justice for the hermit's people and the settlers of Verdant Creek. The impact was immediate and explosive. The journalist in Santa Fe published a series of scathing articles exposing Thorne's decades of corruption, his exploitation of land and water resources, his brutal tactics against settlers and native tribes alike. The territorial governor, faced with irrefutable evidence, public outrage, and pressure from federal authorities, alerted by Colonel Standish, who recognized Thorne's pattern of behavior from past dealings, had no choice but to act. Warrants were issued for Marcus Thorne's arrest on charges of fraud, conspiracy, incitement to violence, and likely murder. Territorial marshals were dispatched to the Circle T ranch with orders to bring Thorne in, by force if necessary. Marcus Thorne, found recovering from his injuries at his opulent ranch house, initially tried to bluster, to bribe, to use his political connections. But the tide had turned. The ledger's revelations had destroyed his reputation, alienated his allies, and armed his enemies. His empire, built on lies and stolen resources, began to crumble. His hired guns deserted him. His fair-weather friends in the capital distanced themselves. Facing certain conviction, stripped of his power and wealth, Marcus Thorne's reign of terror over the New Mexico territory was finally, definitively over. He would spend the rest of his days in a federal prison, a broken man haunted by the ghost of an old hermit and the enduring power of truth. His foreman, Rollins, and several of his key enforcers were also arrested and faced their own reckonings. Back in the hidden valley on the eastern slope of the Sangre de Cristos, the settlers of Verdant Creek and their Ute allies received the news with a mixture of solemn satisfaction and enduring grief for the hermit. They had won. Their homes, their valley, were safe. The stolen waters would, in time, be restored, but the cost had been high. They buried he who remembers the paths with great honor, not in a Christian graveyard, but high on a sacred bluff overlooking the valley he had led them to, a place where the wind whispered through ancient pines and the eagles soared. Ute and settler alike stood side by side, their differences forgotten in shared respect for the old man who had united them. His staff was planted at the head of his grave, a silent sentinel, a reminder of his wisdom, his courage, his sacrifice. In the aftermath, the settlers faced a choice. They could return to Verdant Creek, now freed from Thorne's shadow, and try to rebuild their lives on the parched western plains. Or they could stay here, in this hidden, fertile valley, and forge a new future alongside their Ute allies, learning to live in harmony with the land, guided by the lessons the hermit had taught them. Most chose to stay. The journey over the mountains, the shared struggle, the bond forged with the Ute people, and the profound wisdom imparted by the hermit had changed them. They no longer saw the land as something to be conquered and exploited, but as a living entity to be respected, cherished, and sustained. They began to learn the UTE's ways of farming, of hunting, of living in balance with nature. They shared their own skills, their knowledge of tools and building, creating a unique blended community, a true sanctuary born of shared hardship and mutual respect. Thomas Corbin and Black Hawk became leaders of this new integrated settlement, their friendship a symbol of the hope that had emerged from the ashes of conflict. Young Miguel Garcia, inspired by the hermit, became a student of Ute language and lore, a bridge between the two cultures. Martha, Maria, and Bridget, along with the Ute women, established thriving gardens, using the desert-hardy seeds the hermit had provided, their combined knowledge creating an abundance they had never known before. El Pozo Escondido, the hermit's secret well back in the western foothills, was eventually rediscovered by other struggling settlers, its location perhaps subtly guided by those who knew its secret and wished to share its blessing, a quiet legacy of the old man's generosity. Verdant Creek itself, the original settlement, slowly recovered as water returned to the creek, though it never regained its former population, many of its original families having found a new, deeper promise elsewhere. The story of Thomas Corbin, his family, the settlers of Verdant Creek, and the old man with the secret desert, well became a legend whispered throughout the territory. A tale of how hope can wither under a harsh sun, how greed can poison the land, but also how courage, resilience, and unexpected alliances can bring forth life from the most barren of places. It taught that true wealth lies not in gold or vast herds, but in the life-giving water, the shared harvest, the bonds of community, and the ancient wisdom that teaches us to listen to the land, to respect its secrets, and to cherish its fragile beauty. And it reminded everyone that sometimes the most profound salvation comes not from powerful men or grand schemes, but from a quiet old man, sitting in a dusty doorway, holding the seeds of a different future in his weathered hands. And so, the seasons turn, and life finds a way, even in the harshest of lands. The settlers of Verdant Creek, led by the enigmatic hermit, he who remembers the paths, didn't just survive a drought and a tyrant. They discovered a new way of living, a deeper connection to the earth and to each other. Their journey from despair to a new kind of promise is a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and the profound impact one quiet, courageous individual can have. This story, friends, speaks to us across the years about many things. It speaks of the corrupting nature of unchecked greed, embodied by Marcus Thorne, a man who saw land and water not as life sources, but as commodities to be exploited, regardless of the human or environmental cost. His downfall serves as a stark reminder that empires built on injustice and exploitation are ultimately built on sand, destined to crumble. But more importantly, it speaks of the enduring power of hope, even when it seems all is lost. Thomas Corbin, facing ruin, clinging to a desperate faith, found that hope in the most unexpected of places, a silent old man in a desolate desert dwelling. It reminds us that help often comes from unforeseen quarters, that we should never underestimate the potential for kindness and wisdom in those the world might dismiss as insignificant or strange. The hermit himself is a figure of profound significance. He represents ancient knowledge, a deep ecological wisdom, a spiritual connection to the land that stands in stark contrast to Thorne's rapacious materialism. His actions, sharing his water, his seeds, his knowledge, and ultimately, his life, teach us about true stewardship, about sacrifice, about the quiet, persistent courage it takes to defend what is sacred, what is life-giving. He wasn't just an old man with a secret well, he was a guardian of a legacy, a bridge to a more harmonious way of being. And the alliance formed between the settlers and the Ute people, an alliance born of shared adversity and mutual respect, brokered by the hermit, that's a powerful lesson in itself. It shows us that common ground can be found even between those who seem vastly different. That strength lies in unity, in recognizing our shared humanity and our shared dependence on the earth that sustains us all. In a world often fractured by prejudice and misunderstanding, their story offers a beacon of hope for reconciliation and cooperation. This tale challenges us to look beyond the immediate, the obvious, to see the hidden springs beneath the barren surface, to recognize the wisdom in silence, to understand that true wealth isn't measured in what we own, but in what we cherish, what we protect, what we share. It's about finding our own secret wells, those sources of inner strength, compassion, and resilience that can help us navigate the droughts in our own lives, and perhaps help us make the deserts around us bloom. Out here, in the heart of the American West, where the land itself tells stories of hardship and endurance, the legacy of figures like the hermit and communities like the one forged in that hidden valley endures. They remind us that even in the face of overwhelming odds, courage can take root, hope can blossom, and justice, though sometimes slow and arduous, can ultimately prevail, often through the quiet actions of ordinary people guided by extraordinary wisdom and a commitment to something larger than themselves. If this story of Verdant Creek, of Thomas Corbin and the remarkable hermit, has watered a seed of thought or reflection in your own heart, I invite you to share it. Let their journey inspire others. We'd be honored to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What does it mean to be a true steward of the land? Where have you found unexpected sources of strength or wisdom in your own life? And as always, if you wish to continue exploring these rich, resonant tales from our shared American heritage, these voices of justice that echo from the past and speak to our present, please do subscribe. There are many more paths to walk, many more hidden springs to discover together. Until next time, friends, may you find water in your deserts, may you cherish the wisdom of the old ways, and may you always have the courage to draw your own line in the dust for what is right and true. This is your narrator, wishing you fertile ground for your hopes and a clear path ahead. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night.